23rd August, 1942. The Volga River, Stalingrad. The sky above the city burns. 1,000 Luftwaffe bombers blacken the sun, their engines a thunderous roar that drowns out even the screams below. Flames leap from apartment blocks, factories, and grain silos. The air is thick with ash and the stench of burning wood, flesh, and diesel. On the western bank of the Volga, Soviet soldiers crouch in bomb craters, clutching rifles with trembling hands, watching as their world collapses into an inferno. They have been told to hold this city at all costs. They have been told that beyond the Volga there is nothing, no land, no retreat, only death or victory. In the distance, the first German tanks roll into view, Panzer IVs, their steel hulls caked in dust, their commanders scanning the rubble through field glasses. The men inside those machines have conquered Poland, France, and the Balkans. They believe Stalingrad will fall in days. They are wrong. This city will become their tomb, a frozen hell that will devour an entire army and change the course of human history. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done if you'd been ordered to defend this burning city? To understand why Stalingrad became the graveyard of Hitler's ambitions, we must step back to the summer of 1942, when the entire strategic picture of the Eastern Front hung in the balance. Operation Barbarossa, launched with such confidence in June 1941, had failed to destroy the Soviet Union in a single campaign season. The Wehrmacht had come tantalizingly close to Moscow in December 1941, close enough for German officers to see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. But the Soviet counteroffensive, combined with the brutal Russian winter, had pushed them back. The dream of a swift victory evaporated in the snow and mud. By the spring of 1942, Hitler faced a strategic dilemma. Germany needed oil. The mechanized Wehrmacht consumed fuel at a staggering rate, and the Reich's access to petroleum was limited. The oil fields of the Caucasus, particularly around Baku in Azerbaijan, produced millions of tons of crude oil annually. If Germany could seize those fields, it would solve its fuel crisis and simultaneously cripple the Soviet war machine, which depended heavily on Caucasian oil. Thus was born Fall Blau, Case Blue, the summer offensive of 1942. The plan was ambitious. German forces would drive southeast from their positions in Ukraine, cross the Don River, and push into the Caucasus to capture the oil fields. It was a massive operation involving Army Group South, which was divided into Army Group A and Army Group B. Army Group A would drive south toward the oil fields. Army Group B, which included General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army, would protect the northern flank by advancing to the Volga River and neutralizing Stalingrad. The name Stalingrad carried weight far beyond its industrial significance. Renamed in 1925 to honor Joseph Stalin, the city stretched for over 30 miles along the western bank of the Volga River, a vital artery connecting the Soviet interior to the oil fields of the Caucasus and the agricultural heartland of southern Russia. The city was a major industrial center, producing tanks, artillery, and munitions. Its 3 giant factories, the Red October Steel Factory, the Barikady Gun Factory, and the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory, were among the largest in the Soviet Union. Capturing or neutralizing Stalingrad would sever Soviet supply lines and eliminate a major production center. But there was another dimension to Stalingrad's importance: symbolism.
This was Stalin's city, bearing his name. For Hitler, increasingly obsessed with prestige and symbolic victories, taking Stalingrad would humiliate his Soviet counterpart and deal a devastating blow to Soviet morale. What began as a tactical objective gradually became a personal obsession for both dictators. General Friedrich Paulus was not the stereotypical Prussian warlord. A meticulous staff officer with a talent for logistics and planning. He had served as deputy chief of the German General Staff before being given command of the Sixth Army in January 1942. He was intelligent, methodical, and deeply loyal to Hitler. Some of his peers considered him too cautious, too reliant on orders from above. But in the summer of 1942, he commanded one of the most powerful formations in the Wehrmacht, over 270,000 men, including battle-hardened infantry divisions, panzer and motorized units, and extensive artillery support. The advance toward Stalingrad began in late July. German forces swept across the Don Steppe, pushing aside Soviet resistance. The weather was scorching, temperatures soaring above 40 degrees Celsius. Soldiers marched through clouds of dust, their throats parched, their uniforms caked in dirt. But morale was high. The victories of 1941 and early 1942 had convinced many German soldiers that the Red Army was on the verge of collapse. Stalingrad, they believed, would be just another conquered city on the road to final victory. Soviet forces fell back in disarray, but they were not simply running. Stalin and his high command were buying time, trading space for time to reorganize and reinforce. By early August, Soviet defenses were stiffening. The German advance slowed as resistance intensified. Soviet aircraft appeared in greater numbers, harassing German columns. Artillery fire became more coordinated and deadly. On the 23rd August 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashed its fury on Stalingrad. Over 1,000 aircraft, Heinkel Han 111s, Junkers U-88s, and Stuka dive bombers filled the skies. Wave after wave of bombers carpeted the city with high explosive and incendiary bombs. The attack was intended to break Soviet morale and destroy the city's infrastructure. It succeeded in the latter, but failed catastrophically in the former. The bombing created an apocalyptic scene. Entire neighborhoods vanished in walls of flame. Wooden structures ignited instantly, creating firestorms that sucked oxygen from the air and generated hurricane-force winds. People who sought shelter in basements suffocated as the fires consumed all available oxygen. Others who fled into the streets were incinerated or crushed by collapsing buildings. The Volga itself became a river of fire as oil storage tanks along the riverbank exploded, spreading burning fuel across the water. Residents trying to escape by boat were engulfed in flames. By the evening of 24th August, more than 40,000 civilians were dead. The city center was a smoking wasteland of rubble and twisted metal. German reconnaissance pilots flying over the ruins reported that nothing could have survived such devastation. Surely, they reasoned, Soviet resistance would evaporate. They could not have been more wrong. The man responsible for defending Stalingrad was General Vasily Chuikov, a 42-year-old combat veteran with a reputation for toughness and tactical brilliance. Chuikov was not a nobleman or an intellectual. He was a peasant's son who had risen through the ranks through courage, cunning, and an almost superhuman capacity for endurance. He had fought in the Russian Civil War, served as a military advisor in China, and commanded forces during the Winter War against Finland. By September 1942, when he was appointed commander of the 62nd Army, Chuikov was under no illusions about the task ahead. He was being asked to hold a burning city against the most powerful army in the world. Chuikov understood that conventional defensive tactics would fail in Stalingrad. The Germans possessed overwhelming advantages in armor, artillery, and air power. In open terrain, Soviet forces would be annihilated. But in the close confines of urban combat, those advantages would diminish. Chuikov articulated his strategy in simple terms. We will hug the Germans so close that their artillery and aircraft cannot be used without killing their own men. This doctrine of hugging the enemy transformed Stalingrad into a nightmare for German forces. Soviet positions were established as close as possible to German lines, sometimes separated by a single wall, a staircase, or a floor of a building. This proximity neutralized German firepower. Artillery observers couldn't call in strikes without endangering friendly troops. Luftwaffe pilots couldn't identify targets in the chaos of intermingled positions. The battle devolved into savage close-quarters combat, fought with grenades, submachine guns, bayonets, and entrenching tools. Chuikov established his headquarters on the eastern bank of the Volga, connected to his forces in the city by radio and by perilous crossings under fire. Every night, boats and makeshift rafts ferried reinforcements, ammunition, and supplies across the river. German artillery and aircraft relentlessly targeted these crossings. Thousands of Soviet soldiers drowned or were killed before they even set foot in Stalingrad, but the flow never stopped. Stalin had declared that the city must hold, and Chuikov was determined to obey, no matter the cost. The German Sixth Army entered Stalingrad's northern suburbs in early September, expecting to fight through demoralized remnants and reach the Volga in days. Instead, they encountered a defense unlike anything they had experienced. Soviet soldiers fought from cellars, sewers, and rubble piles. Snipers concealed in the wreckage picked off officers and tank commanders. Machine gunners established killing zones in blown-out apartments, mowing down German infantry as they advanced down streets. The fighting was surreal and horrifying. Buildings became vertical battlefields, with Soviets holding the upper floors while Germans controlled the ground level, or vice versa. Soldiers lobbed grenades through holes in ceilings and floors. Firefights erupted at ranges of 5 or 10 meters. The sound was constant and deafening. The crack of rifles, the burst of submachine guns, the crump of mortars, the roar of collapsing masonry. One German officer described the combat. We would fight all day to capture a single building, only to discover the next morning that the Russians had infiltrated during the night and reoccupied positions we thought we had cleared. It was maddening. You could never be certain where the enemy was. A quiet cellar might contain a dozen Soviet soldiers waiting to ambush you. German casualties mounted at an alarming rate. Battalions that began with 800 men were reduced to 200 within weeks. Replacements arrived, but they were increasingly poorly trained and unprepared for the horror of urban combat. Morale began to erode. Soldiers wrote letters home describing Stalingrad as a Rattenkrieg, a rat war, where survival was measured in hours, not days. By late September, the Sixth Army had fought its way into the city center and reached the Volga in several places, cutting the Soviet 62nd Army into isolated pockets. It seemed the battle might be over. But Chuikov refused to yield. He ordered his fragmented units to hold their positions and continue fighting, and they did, with a determination that bordered on fanatical. One of the most legendary episodes of the battle was the defense of Pavlov's house, a 4-story apartment building that became a symbol of Soviet resistance. In late September, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a reconnaissance platoon of about 30 soldiers occupied the building, which overlooked a key square in the city center known as 9th January Square. The building provided excellent observation over German positions and routes of advance. Pavlov's men transformed the apartment building into a miniature fortress. They fortified the structure with sandbags, barbed wire, and anti-tank mines. They knocked holes through interior walls to create fields of fire and evacuation routes. They positioned anti-tank rifles and machine guns at key windows. They dug a communication trench to connect with other Soviet positions, allowing them to receive supplies and reinforcements without exposing themselves to German fire. For 58 days, from late September until late November, Pavlov's men held that building against repeated German assaults. The Germans threw infantry, tanks, and artillery at the position, but could not dislodge the defenders. Every assault was beaten back with heavy losses. Soviet soldiers inside the building survived on minimal rations, caught rainwater to drink, and endured constant bombardment. The Germans became obsessed with capturing Pavlov's house. One German general famously claimed, perhaps with hyperbole, that his forces lost more men trying to take that single building than they had lost capturing Paris. Whether literally true or not, the statement captured the grinding, attrition-heavy nature of the fighting in Stalingrad. Yakov Pavlov survived the battle and was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor in the Red Army. After the war, the building was preserved as a memorial. It still stands today, a testament to the courage and tenacity of its defenders.
As September turned to October, the fighting intensified around the factory district in northern Stalingrad. The 3 massive industrial complexes, Red October, Barekari, and Dzerzhinsky, became the focal points of brutal combat. These were not ordinary factories. They were sprawling industrial landscapes covering hundreds of acres, filled with workshops, foundries, assembly halls, warehouses, and railway sidings. The buildings were constructed of reinforced concrete and steel, designed to withstand industrial accidents, which made them incredibly resistant to artillery and bombs. The factories provided ideal defensive terrain. Soviet soldiers fought from behind blast furnaces, overturned machinery, and steel girders. They established sniper nests in crane cabins and water towers. They rigged booby traps in darkened corridors and collapsed tunnels. The Germans, accustomed to open-terrain maneuver warfare, were forced to fight room by room, machine by machine, in an environment that nullified their tactical advantages. One particularly hellish location was the Red October factory. The foundries and blast furnaces, damaged by bombing and shelling, continued to smolder, filling the air with choking smoke and noxious fumes. Soldiers fought in near-total darkness, illuminated only by the flickering glow of fires and muzzle flashes. The ground was slick with oil, blood, and melted metal. Corpses lay where they fell, often for days, as neither side could safely retrieve them. A Soviet soldier who fought in the Red October factory later wrote, "Hell is not fire and brimstone. Hell is a darkened factory floor where you cannot see 5 meters ahead, where every shadow might be an enemy, where the air burns your lungs and the ground is slippery with the blood of your comrades. Hell is fighting for 12 hours straight, and then realizing you have gained nothing, that tomorrow you will fight again for the same piece of ground. By early November, the Germans had pushed the Soviets into a strip of land along the Volga, no more than a few hundred meters wide. Chukov's headquarters was under constant shell fire. Several times, Soviet commanders recommended evacuation. Each time, Chukov refused. "If we cross the Volga, we will never come back. We stay and fight." The Germans launched one final desperate offensive in mid-November, throwing their last reserves into the battle. Paulus committed every available man and tank, determined to finish the fight before winter. For several days, it seemed the Soviets might break. German infantry reached the riverbank in multiple locations, isolating Soviet units. But Chukov's men held. Outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded, they continued to resist. And then, on 19th November 1942, everything changed. While the Sixth Army had been bleeding itself white in the ruins of Stalingrad, Soviet High Command had been planning a counteroffensive of unprecedented scale. General Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most talented strategist, and General Alexander Vasilevsky, chief of the General Staff, had spent months quietly assembling forces far to the north and south of the city. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and vast stockpiles of ammunition were moved into position under strict secrecy. The Soviets had identified a critical weakness in German dispositions. The long flanks of the Stalingrad salient were held not by German troops, but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units. These Allied formations were poorly equipped, poorly trained, and stretched dangerously thin. They lacked adequate anti-tank weapons, winter clothing, and morale. The Soviet intelligence had noted this vulnerability, and Zhukov intended to exploit it. Operation Uranus called for a massive double envelopment. Soviet forces would smash through the weak Romanian positions north and south of Stalingrad, then drive toward each other to encircle the entire Sixth Army. If successful, it would be one of the largest encirclements in military history. On the morning of 19th November, in freezing fog and light snow, the northern pincer launched its attack. Over 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire on Romanian positions, pulverizing trenches and command posts. Then came the tanks, hundreds of T-34s and KV-1s, supported by waves of infantry. The Romanian Third Army, already demoralized and undersupplied, collapsed within hours. Entire divisions disintegrated. Survivors fled west in panic, abandoning weapons and equipment. The next day, 20th November, the southern pincer struck. Soviet forces slammed into the Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad with equally devastating results. Once again, Romanian defenses crumbled. The two Soviet spearheads, one from the north, one from the south, raced toward each other, covering over 100 miles in just 4 days. On 23rd November, near the town of Kalach, approximately 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad, advance elements of the Soviet 4th Tank Corps and the 4th Mechanized Corps met. The encirclement was complete. Over 290,000 German and Axis soldiers, the entire 6th Army, plus elements of the 4th Panzer Army, were trapped in a pocket approximately 50 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. The news reached Paulus's headquarters like a thunderbolt. His first reaction was to request permission to break out immediately, while Soviet forces were still organizing and the encirclement was relatively weak. He radioed Hitler, explaining the situation and asking for authorization to retreat west and fight his way out of the pocket. Hitler's response was swift and catastrophic. "The Sixth Army will hold its position. Surrender is out of question. The army will hold its ground until relieved."
The order was influenced by Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, who confidently assured Hitler that the Air Force could supply the Sixth Army by air. Göring claimed the Luftwaffe could deliver 300 tons of supplies per day, the minimum required to sustain the encircled forces. It was a reckless promise based on wishful thinking rather than logistical reality. Paulus, ever the obedient soldier, complied with Hitler's order. The Sixth Army would stay in the pocket and await relief. It was a decision that doomed hundreds of thousands of men. The Luftwaffe's attempt to supply the Sixth Army was a disaster from the outset. The 300 tons per day that Göring had promised proved impossible to deliver. The Luftwaffe lacked sufficient transport aircraft. The distances involved were too great. The weather in late November and December was abysmal. Blizzards, fog, and freezing temperatures grounded flights for days at a time. And Soviet anti-aircraft defenses and fighter patrols wreaked havoc on German transport planes.
The lumbering Junkers Ju-52 transports, the workhorses of the German airlift, were slow and vulnerable. Soviet pilots in Yak-1 and Log-3 fighters hunted them mercilessly. German transport crews flew through storms of flak and interceptors, and many never made it to the pocket. Those that did land found themselves on airfields under constant artillery bombardment. Unloading supplies became a frantic, deadly race against incoming shells. On a good day, the Luftwaffe delivered 100 tons of supplies. On most days, it was far less. By December, the average was barely 60 tons per day, 1/5 of what was needed. The shortfall was catastrophic. Rations were cut, then cut again. By late December, German soldiers were surviving on 200 grams of bread per day, about one thin slice, and watery soup made from horse bones. Hunger gnawed at the Sixth Army. Horses were slaughtered for meat. When the horses were gone, men scavenged the ruins for anything remotely edible: frozen potatoes, leather belts, even wallpaper paste. Soldiers became gaunt and hollow-eyed, their uniforms hanging loose on emaciated frames. Starvation weakened immune systems, and disease spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia killed thousands. The cold was equally merciless. Winter arrived in full force in late November, and temperatures plummeted to -20, then -30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers had not been issued winter clothing. They wore the same uniforms they had fought in during the summer, lightweight tunics and trousers, utterly inadequate for the Russian winter. Men stuffed newspaper and straw into their uniforms for insulation. They wrapped their feet in rags. It was never enough. Frostbite became epidemic. Soldiers lost toes, fingers, ears, and noses. Medics amputated frozen limbs with whatever tools they had, often without anesthesia, as medical supplies had run out. The wounded lay in freezing cellars and dugouts, untreated and forgotten, slowly dying from infections and gangrene. One German soldier wrote in his diary, "We are no longer men. We are ghosts. We shuffle through the snow, half frozen, half starved, too numb to think. We have stopped dreaming of victory. We dream only of warmth, of bread, of sleep. And we know we will never have any of these things again." In mid-December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate attempt to break through the Soviet encirclement and relieve the Sixth Army. Manstein commanded Army Group Don, assembled from forces scraped together from across the Eastern Front. His spearhead, the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth, drove northeast toward Stalingrad with about 230 tanks and 3 infantry divisions. The relief force made rapid initial progress, smashing through Soviet defensive lines. By 19th December, Hoth's panzers had advanced to within 48 kilometers of the pocket. For a brief moment, it seemed rescue was possible.
Manstein radioed Paulus urging him to launch a breakout operation, codenamed Operation Thunderclap, to link up with the advancing relief force. But Paulus hesitated. His forces were weak, low on fuel, and spread across the pocket in defensive positions. Breaking out would require abandoning equipment and concentrating forces for an attack, a risky maneuver. More importantly, Hitler had explicitly forbidden any attempt to abandon Stalingrad. Paulus, ever obedient, refused to act without authorization from the Führer. Hitler, in turn, refused to give that authorization. He insisted that the Sixth Army hold Stalingrad and wait for Manstein to break through to them. The opportunity slipped away. Soviet forces counterattacked, hitting Manstein's flanks and forcing him to halt. By 19th December, Operation Winter Storm had stalled. On 24th December, Hoth began a fighting withdrawal. The relief attempt had failed. The Sixth Army was abandoned to its fate. Manstein's withdrawal triggered another Soviet offensive, Operation Little Saturn, which threatened to encircle Manstein's own forces. The strategic situation on the southern front was collapsing. Hitler finally authorized the evacuation of the Caucasus and a general withdrawal, but it was too late for the men trapped in Stalingrad. January 1943 brought no relief, only intensified suffering. The Soviet noose tightened day by day, compressing the pocket into an ever smaller area. The Luftwaffe's supply effort had effectively collapsed. Soviet anti-aircraft fire was so intense that German pilots refused to land inside the pocket, instead dropping supplies from altitude. Most of the cargo was destroyed on impact or drifted into Soviet lines. On 8 January, the Soviets offered Paulus terms of surrender. A delegation under a white flag approached German lines and delivered an ultimatum: surrender honorably, and all prisoners would receive humane treatment, medical care for the wounded, adequate food, and eventual repatriation to Germany after the war. Paulus consulted with Hitler by radio. Hitler's response was unequivocal: surrender is out of question. Paulus declined the Soviet offer. The final Soviet assault began on January 10, 1943. Over 7,000 Soviet artillery pieces, the largest concentration of firepower ever assembled on the Eastern Front, opened fire on the western edge of the pocket. The bombardment was apocalyptic, obliterating German positions. Then came the infantry and tanks, wave after wave, overwhelming the starving, frost-bitten defenders. German resistance, though fierce in places, was ultimately futile. Units ran out of ammunition and fought with bayonets and rocks. Others simply surrendered, too weak to continue. The pocket was split into two, creating a northern and southern caissel, or cauldron. Communication between the two was severed. By late January, the southern pocket had been reduced to a few square kilometers of rubble in the city center. Paulus's headquarters was in the basement of the Univermag department store on Red Square. The building was surrounded by Soviet troops. There was no escape. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Hitler sent Paulus a final message, promoting him to the rank of field marshal. It was a cynical gesture. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. They were expected to fight to the death or commit suicide rather than suffer the dishonor of surrender. Hitler was sending a clear message: die or take your own life. Paulus chose a third option.
On 31st January 1943, Soviet troops stormed the Univermag building. They found Paulus in a basement room, hollow-eyed and exhausted, but alive. A Soviet officer entered and asked, "Are you Field Marshal Paulus?" The German commander nodded. "I am here to accept your surrender." Paulus surrendered, becoming the first German field marshal ever captured alive. His staff officers and bodyguards laid down their weapons. Across the southern pocket, German resistance collapsed. By the end of the day, over 91,000 German soldiers had been taken prisoner.
The northern pocket held out for one more day. On 2nd February, the last remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Of the 290,000 Axis soldiers encircled in November, approximately 100,000 had been killed or died of starvation and disease during the siege. Another 91,000 were captured in the final surrender. Of those prisoners, fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. The rest died in Soviet POW camps from malnutrition, disease, overwork, and mistreatment. One of the great tragedies of the war was the fate of these prisoners, men who had survived the battle only to perish in captivity. Soviet losses were staggering in absolute terms. Over 1.1 million Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the Stalingrad campaign, along with an estimated 40,000 civilians. The human cost was almost beyond calculation. But unlike Germany, the Soviet Union had vast reserves of manpower and could replace its losses. Germany could not. The impact of Stalingrad reverberated far beyond the battlefield. For the first time in the war, an entire German field army, one of the most powerful and experienced formations in the Wehrmacht, had been annihilated. The myth of German invincibility, carefully cultivated by years of victories, shattered. In Germany, the propaganda ministry announced 3 days of national mourning. Joseph Goebbels delivered a radio address describing the fall of the Sixth Army as a heroic sacrifice. But the German people, who had been fed a steady diet of victory propaganda, were stunned. They began to grasp a terrible truth. The war could be lost. Morale plummeted. Recruitment for the armed forces became more difficult. Dissent and defeatism, previously almost unthinkable, began to surface. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a symbol of resilience and ultimate triumph. The city was awarded the title Hero City, one of the highest honors in the Soviet system. Monuments and memorials were erected across the country. The battle became a cornerstone of Soviet identity, a story of ordinary people achieving extraordinary feats through courage and sacrifice. Stalin, who had micromanaged much of the war effort and made catastrophic strategic errors in 1941, emerged from Stalingrad with enhanced prestige. The victory vindicated his decision to stand and fight rather than trade territory for time, even though that decision had cost over 1 million lives. Strategically, Stalingrad marked the turning point on the Eastern Front. After the surrender, the Soviets launched a series of offensives that drove German forces back hundreds of miles. The Wehrmacht would never again regain the strategic initiative in the East. From Stalingrad onward, the Red Army was on the offensive, pushing relentlessly toward Berlin. For the individual soldiers who fought there, Stalingrad was an experience that defied words. German survivors spoke of it as a descent into hell, a nightmare of cold, hunger, and death from which they never fully recovered. Soviet veterans remembered it as the hardest test of their lives, a crucible in which they had proven their courage and determination. One Soviet nurse who had treated wounded soldiers throughout the battle walked through the ruins after the German surrender. She later recalled, "I walked through streets I no longer recognized. Every building was a shell. There were no trees, no birds, no children, just silence and snow covering the bodies. We had won, they told us. We had saved the city. But looking around, I wondered what we had saved. Only ghosts lived there now. Ghosts and memories." The Battle of Stalingrad stands as one of the most brutal and consequential battles in human history. It was a battle that consumed armies, obliterated a city, and altered the trajectory of the Second World War. In its aftermath, over 2 million people, soldiers and civilians, lay dead or maimed. An ancient city had been reduced to rubble, and the German war machine, once thought unstoppable, had been dealt a blow from which it would never recover. The frozen ruins of Stalingrad became a graveyard for Hitler's dream of conquest, the hubris that led the Wehrmacht into that frozen hell, the refusal to retreat, the insistence on symbolic victories over strategic sense, the contempt for an enemy deemed inferior, all of it was laid bare in the snow and ruggle of a city on the Volga. And from that graveyard the Red Army rose, bloodied, exhausted, but unbroken. The soldiers who survived Stalingrad carried with them the knowledge that they had faced the worst and endured. They would carry that knowledge all the way to Berlin. The lesson of Stalingrad was written in blood and snow. No army, no matter how powerful, can survive when pride overrules reason, when symbolism trumps strategy, and when the lives of soldiers are spent in pursuit of a dictator's vanity. Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was a reckoning. But far to the west, across the vast expanses of Eastern Europe, another titanic clash was brewing that would dwarf even Stalingrad in scale. Join us next time as we uncover the story of the Battle of Kursk, the greatest tank battle in history, where over 6,000 armored vehicles met in an apocalyptic struggle that would seal Germany's fate forever.